The first chapter that we're going to cover in Biology 1407 is Chapter 20, which covers the subject of phylogeny. We're not going to cover all of the sections. We're just going to cover sections 1, 2, and 3. So those are the only 3 sections that you need to read and study. And this presentation will cover some of, but maybe not all of, the main topics and terms that I really want you guys to understand within phylogeny. So the term phylogeny is just the evolutionary history of a species or a group of related species. So it tells us where they came from, what the common ancestor was that maybe they evolved from, and what they're related to, among some other things. This term, systematics, the science of systematics, is what classifies organisms and determines their evolutionary relationships. And so we use phylogeny to help us understand systematics and vice versa. So I would definitely know those two terms. Humans like to organize and group things together to make things make sense. And so basically that is what taxonomy is. It is dividing, organizing, and naming organisms. And if we didn't have taxonomy, then we wouldn't have names for things, like we wouldn't know the difference between humans and dogs, mammals versus reptiles, and vice versa. So to give you an example of a couple of animals that seem to be related, but maybe aren't exactly the same. If we look at legless lizards, like I think we call them skinks, and also snakes, they are not sisters. I guess you could call them cousins. But legless lizards and snakes, although they look very similar to one another, are two completely different types of organisms made up of many different species. Legless lizards and snakes probably evolved from a common ancestor that was a lizard that had legs. And that ancestor went extinct, died off, and branched off and made new species like lizards that have legs, more lizards that have legs, snakes, and legless lizards. Legless lizards evolved independently in several different groups through adaptation to similar environments. So they didn't branch off from snakes. They lived in different environments. There was no need to have legs. And so over time, they adapted to living in an environment where legs weren't necessary. They probably was a benefit to have smaller and smaller and smaller legs. And so those survived versus others that had bigger legs. And the bigger legs started to die off. Those that were born with smaller legs started mating with others that had smaller legs, producing offspring with even smaller legs until it got to the point where they no longer had legs at all. For whatever reason, that was a benefit to that environment. And so if you look at a phylogenetic table here, you can see that this ancestral lizard with limbs is an extinct animal, doesn't exist anymore. But at this point here, it starts to branch off and make different, what we call clades. We'll talk about this a little bit more. Different groups. Okay, so geckos evolved from these ancestral lizards down here. But then up here, every little kind of trunk of the tree or branch here. Let's see if I can get this to, here we go. So we have, right, our ancestral lizard right here. Here it shows that we made 2 different types of animals. So geckos branched off and really haven't changed very much, which lets us know that they, at least on this tree, that they're a little bit maybe more ancestral. They contain some of the more ancestral traits that their original ancestor had. Right here, we can see that there was a common ancestor here as well that produced those that had no limbs, which were snakes, and then snakes have kind of stayed the same. But this guy produced another common ancestor who went extinct and produced 2 other types of lizards, iguanas, and then another common ancestor that didn't survive, who branched off to produce the monitor lizard, and then lizards with no limbs right here. So These two, this trait of no limbs happened at very, very different times, um, times in space, times as far as eras go, probably, and happened independently of one another. Although they are still related, lizards are related to snakes, they didn't branch off from an initial from a common ancestor, right? They did way over here, but there were so many other common ancestors that occurred along the lines. We often see this picture, which is very, very, very inaccurate, because this picture indicates that chimps started to stand upright and then started to use their hands, and right here they show, I guess, tools, started to be a little bit more upright, and then finally became humans. And really, that's not at all how it happened. It's not a gradual progression, as you see in images like this that are on t-shirts and all sorts of other things. Instead, what happened was we had common ancestors that relate us to chimps and other apes, but those died off. So there was this original ancestor, this hominin ancestor, who is no longer exists anymore, who produced chimps up here, still existing, and then produced another common ancestor, made whatever this guy is, who's not really a chimpanzee, but somewhere in between, doesn't exist anymore, right? These guys don't exist anymore. There are all these things that don't exist anymore that arose from other species arose from them. So something had to die off and go extinct to produce something different, right? And we know, like way up here, of course, we're still alive, but no longer is there are there Neanderthals. So while Neanderthals, you might hear that Neanderthals were the first humans, and in a sense that is correct, but in reality it's not. They're not humans at all. Humans are their own separate species. Neanderthals were their own separate species. We derive from a common ancestor, but Neanderthals never made it. So this image right here, totally incorrect, because it's not a gradual thing. It's not like this guy is still alive and then made this. Something happened. Two different species arose, right? You got species X and species A that arose from this guy who didn't exist anymore. I would also understand what binomial nomenclature is. So Carl Linnaeus, who you guys heard about and learned about last semester, is the father of taxonomy. He's the one that originally started grouping things together, and he developed this system today that we call binomial nomenclature, and it's a two-feature system that gives two names, a two-part name for a species, and it's very useful because it's universal. So while we might call I don't know, here we might call a cockroach. Somewhere else they use a different common name for it, like um, up north they like to call them water bugs, or they call them palmetto bugs, or they give them different names, right? So having common names isn't really all that useful, but having this binomial nomenclature where they have a genus and a species is useful because we can use it universally. We can talk to a scientist in France and they'll know what species that we are talking about. So the first part of the name is called the genus. The second part is called the species, and so I would um, relate it to your first and last name. While there might be very, very many Evans in the world, there may not be as many Evan Martinez's, right? So genus is like your first name. It still relates you to something. It still tells you what you are, but the species, or the second part of it, is like your last name, and that tells you exactly who you are. So for instance, for humans, it's Homo sapien, right? Homo is the genus, sapien is the species. There's a lot of other species that are in the genus Homo, don't exist anymore. But Homo sapien tells us, oh, it's not a Neanderthal. It's not one of those other things that I showed you on that phylogenetic tree. We also separate the two words. They're not together as one word. And the first letter is always capitalized. The second letter is not the second word is not, and it's either italicized, or if you can't italicize it, then you underline it. So be able to maybe recognize what is the proper way to write this species name in binomial nomenclature. That would hopefully be an easy question for you. So Linnaeus also did some other things. Because he did taxonomy, and taxonomy is the science of grouping and classifying things, he grouped things into narrow and broad fields, right? So the biggest, this goes from smallest to largest, the biggest field that we can group something in is a domain. The second largest, so this is the biggest umbrella. Underneath the umbrella kingdom, we've kicked some things out. Then you get into phylum, it's getting a little bit smaller. Class is even smaller. Order is quite smaller. Family, and then we get down to genus and species. So think of these as umbrellas getting smaller and smaller. At some point, you kick some things out and you get more narrow, more classified. So if you're given a list of things, what is in the order hierarchy of greatest, most inclusive to least inclusive, domain is most inclusive, species is least inclusive. One way to remember the order of this is to remember I don't know what you call it, but remember the term King Philip came over for a good supper, and that will help you try to remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Domain is actually a new one since um, probably some of you were in elementary school or even middle school when you first learned this kind of stuff. Domain is one of the newer ones that we started learning or that we started adding to it. So you got to figure out something, a D for that. So here's an example if we look at, I guess, going up to panthers or leopards or whatever that cat is. But they're in the domain Eukarya, all eukaryotic organisms. So we've kicked out bacteria and other prokaryotes, I guess. Kingdom Animalia includes everything that's an animal. It's going to include insects and whales and humans and other mammals and reptiles and birds. Phylum Chordata, now we've kicked out insects and we've kicked out those that don't have a chord or those that are not chordates. That sometimes kicks out things like earthworms and other stuff like that. Narrowing it down a little bit more to class Mammalia, now we've kicked out the reptiles and the birds and we've kicked out anything that doesn't have hair, right? Order Carnivora, now we've kicked out anything that doesn't eat meat. So we've kicked, I guess, cows and things like that out of here, cows and horses. Family Felidae, so we're probably getting down to things that are just cats. I would imagine that, other felines are going to be in this family, like house cats and things like that. Genus Panthera, now we've kicked out our house cats and probably our foxes and other things like that. And then species Panthera pardus is very, very, very specific. It only talks about this one species. So I would understand that hierarchy and how it narrows things down. Phylum is larger than order, order being larger than genus, species being the most specific that you can get. Here's just another phylogenetic tree that kind of shows you that. So order Carnivora, actually I can't really stand this image because it confuses you with phylogenetic trees, but what it's trying to show you is that Carnivora is a large order that encompasses all of these things. But when you get down to family, now you've kicked some of these things out. So we're family Felidae, separates the panthers from the otters and whatever you call otters and badgers and things, mustelids, and then Canidae is separate from them too. So family is starting to separate things out. So systematics, that science of systematics depicts evolutionary relationships, and we use phylogenetics or phylogenetic trees to help represent hypotheses about these relationships. I would know what branch points are, and that each branch point represents the divergence of two taxa from a common ancestor. So that's something I kept trying to show you in the other images, is that it branched off, you had a common ancestor, but from that common ancestor arose two different species. Maybe it was three, maybe it was four, it can be multiple, but most likely it's usually two different taxa, two different things branched off from a common ancestor. Sister taxa are groups that share an immediate common ancestor. So let me just go here really quick to talk about those things. So number one would be the branch point. We had a common ancestor, and right here it branched off. It went one way or the other, making two different type of taxa, or two different groups, right? Here's another branch point right here, where this common ancestor probably branched off, right? Making two different groups. Over here are sister taxa. So B and C are sister taxa because if you come back and look, they share this common ancestor at number 4, right? They both branch directly off of this common ancestor here. A rooted tree includes a branch to represent the most recent common ancestor of all the taxa in a tree. Basal taxon diverge early in the history and originate near the common ancestor. So right here, number 1 would be, of course, this is a rooted tree because we have a common ancestor right here. And then that basal taxon, right, these guys right here. Well, if you come back, their common ancestor is actually this guy, if you try to go back and look at it. So while they're related to one another, they diverged early in the history of a group, and that divergence originated very close to the common ancestor of that group. Polytomy is a branch from which more than two groups emerge. So right here, we had 1, 2, and 3 different groups that branched off. So originally, I had said usually it's 2, and that is true, but when you have multiple, we call it polytomy. So I know that term as well. So when you look at here, this is a rooted tree, right? Because we have a common ancestor. We have branch points here, 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 etc. This guy and Homo sapiens would be considered what kind of taxa? Basal taxa, right? Because we originated from an early common ancestor down at the bottom, whereas, let me change the color of my pen. Whereas these two guys and Homo sapiens and Neanderthals are considered sister taxa because we came from a direct common ancestor. So I would hope that I'm making sense, first of all, but also that if you were given a tree like this, that you would be able to point out who is who. Remember that these are time tests, so I would study, you've got to study something, otherwise you'll never finish it in time. The questions in time, you're given about a minute and a half to 2 minutes per question, which is plenty of time per question, even if it was like a word question, but not quite enough time to search the book through everything to get the answers. So, but also remember that you still will be, I'm not there, so you're going to be able to go through your book if you want to. So what we can and cannot learn from phylogenetic trees. So phylogenetic trees will show us a pattern of descent, but they don't show us phenotypic similarity. So do you remember, think back to what a phenotype and a genotype are. Phenotypes are the way you look. So phylogenetic trees show us patterns of descent. We descended for something, but they don't show us what we look like, what we look similar to. That's not the point of them. They don't generally indicate when a species evolved or how much change occurred in the lineage. Probably, if we look at this tree, there's a lot of pieces that are missing from it. This might be very, very simplified. In this tree, they've given us a timeline here, but that is not what it always tells us. And it should not be assumed that a taxon evolved from the taxon right next to it. So like this group shouldn't be assumed that it evolved from the guy right next to it, because probably there were many, many, many steps along the way between. The point is that a phylogenetic tree can be as inclusive or as exclusive, have as many holes in it as the person who made it wants, because it's trying to tell us something and it may not be telling us everything. So phylogeny does provide important information about similar characteristics in closely related species, thinking back to maybe the snakes. And a lot of times they're based on DNA sequences so that we can figure out who is most likely related to one another. And I'm really not going to get into that DNA stuff. Okay, so that's concept one. It's mainly a lot of vocabulary terms and understanding how to read a phylogenetic tree. Concept two, section two, is phylogenies are inferred from morphological and molecular data. So we're looking at DNA, but also the way that things look to determine who seems to be related to one another. To infer phylogeny, systematics gather information about morphologies, genes, and biochemistry of the relevant organisms. So we're not just looking at one specific thing like, oh, what does its arm look like? We're looking at multiple things to decide if they share a common ancestor. Phenotypic and genetic similarities due to shared ancestry are called homologies. So if you've got similarities, we call it homologous or homologies. And organisms with similar morphologies or DNA sequences are more likely to be closely related than organisms with different structures or sequences. So when you are constructing a phylogeny, systematics need to distinguish whether the similarity is a result of homology, whether it's homologous, which means that phenotypic and genetic similarities happened, or whether it's an analogy. Analogy is due to convergent evolution. So an analogy would be like the development of wings in birds versus bats. Well, they're different groups, right? Bats are mammals, birds are birds. And so while it's analogous that they have wings that are used for flight, it is not homologous, meaning that it evolved because of a shared common ancestor. So definitely know the difference between a homology and an analogy, or knowing that something is homologous versus analogous. Convergent evolution, which arrives from things that are analogous, occurs when similar environmental pressures and natural selection produce similar adaptations in organisms. The need to fly away from your predators, right? Or in the example here, Australian marsupial mole, North American eutherian mole, they share common traits, but they live in totally different continents, so they're not going to have probably a common ancestor. Maybe, I mean, they are mammals, so far, way down the line when it was Pangea and everything was connected, probably so there was a common ancestor, but so far ago that it doesn't make sense. Analogous structures or molecular sequences that evolved independently are also called homoplasies. And I hate that because you think of homologous, right? And homoplasies would make you think of homologous. Well, try not to. Homoplasies are analogous structures. That's going to be kind of a tough one. At least it always is for me to try to distinguish between the two. Homology can be distinguished from an analogy by comparing fossil evidence and the degree of complexity. The more complex two structures are, the more likely that they are homologous. So if we look at a couple of different examples, bat wings and butterfly wings are analogous because they're both used for flight. They have the same function, but they're not homologous in any way. However, if we start to look at maybe the hand of different organisms, different mammals, human hand is analogous to a horse hoof, to a cat's paw, to the main wing part on the bat, to the tip of a bird's wing, and to a whale's fin. Those are all part of their fingers. They're all tarsi. They're just adapted for the world that these different mammals live in. Okay, so concept 20.2, section 20.2 is all about what homologous and analogous structures are basically. So make sure that you can identify those. Concept 20.3, section 20.3, are shared characters are used to construct phylogenetic trees. So once homologous characters have been identified, they can be used to infer phylogeny. And cladistics classifies organisms by common descent. You heard me talking about clades earlier. A clade is a group of species that includes an ancestral species and all of its descendants. So clades can be nested within larger clades, but not all groupings of organisms qualify as a clade. There's different types of clades. Monophyletic clades signify that it consists of an ancestor species and all of its descendants. So right here is a monophyletic clade. Group or species A, B, and C all came from this one ancestor. Paraphyletic clades or grouping consists of ancestral species in some, but not all of the descents. So here we're looking at D, E, and F, and we left G out. So we're looking at some, but not all. And the common ancestor here that we've gone back a little further to 2. Clades can include smaller clades, right? So right here, for sure, is a smaller clade within this larger clade. And a polyphyletic clade is a grouping consisting of various taxa with different ancestors. So in this case, we're looking at A, B, C, and D. And D here came from a different ancestor right here. So again, groups consist of various taxa with different ancestors. In a monophyletic and a paraphyletic clade, what we saw was that we had a common ancestor. Here, it's branched off much further. I guess you could actually say that this one is also paraphyletic and polyphyletic, couldn't you? Because you've got 2 different common ancestors right here. In a paraphyletic group, the most recent common ancestors of all the members of the group is part of the group. In a polyphyletic group, the most recent common ancestor is not part of the group. So let's look at that again. In a paraphyletic group, the most recent common ancestor of the group is part of the group. Oh, yeah. So like in this case, he's still part of the group. Still part of the group. Yeah, still part of the group because D is in there, I guess, and this guy is still part of the group. In comparison with its ancestor, an organism has both shared and different characteristics. If it didn't have different characteristics, there wouldn't be a different species, right? So shared ancestral characteristics is a character that originates in an ancestor of the taxon. Shared derived character is an evolutionary novelty unique to that particular clade. A character can be both ancestral and derived depending on the context. So here we're looking at, these are all different characters, right? So if we look at hair here, this would be a derived trait, right? Because we're branching off from turtles and things that have amniotic fluid. Probably it's its own thing specific to the leopards, not the other guys. A vertebral column is an ancestral trait. All of these guys have a vertebral column. Hinged jaw is also a shared trait amongst these guys, but it's derived from whoever this common ancestor was right here. 4 limbs is a derived trait. It's now different from all these fishy-like things, right? And these guys have the 4 limbs. Amniotic fluid, possessing the amnion, now separates reptiles out from, amphibians out from the reptiles and the leopards. When inferring evolutionary relationships, it is useful to know which clade a shared derived character first appeared. An outgroup is a species or group of species that's closely related to the in-group, the various species being studied. The outgroup is a group that diverged before the in-group, and systematics compare each in-group species with the outgroup to differentiate between shared and derived and shared ancestral species. So this is the outgroup, the lancet, because it broke off way early, way at the beginning of some common ancestor over here. And so these guys would be the in-group, right? If you took all of the rest out and maybe we were just looking at this little clade, who would be the outgroup? The frog, right? Because it branched off earlier. And these guys would be, turtle and leopards would be the in-group. Characters shared by the outgroup and in-group are ancestral characters that predate the divergence of both groups from a common ancestor. So going back, the lancet has no I guess the Lancet has no vertebral column, so there's some shared characteristic that happened here that's ancestral. So the Lancet is the outgroup, shares something with all of these guys, but it's not a vertebral column, hinge jaws, forelimbs, amnion, or hair. Okay, systematics can never be sure of finding the best tree in a large data set. They narrow possibilities by applying the principle of maximum parsimony. Maximum parsimony assumes that the tree requires the fewest evolutionary events. So it's trying to give you the least amount of branches. Computer programs are used to search for trees that are parsimonious. So I would just know the term maximum parsimony assumes that the tree requires the fewest evolutionary events. The best hypothesized phylogenetic tree fits the most data. So the most things that are alike, looking morphologically or phenotype, right? Molecular, DNA, and also by your fossil record. If all of those things match, this is the best hypothesized phylogenetic tree. Phylogenetic hypotheses are modified when new evidences arise. So it's a hypothesis that can be proven using morphology, molecular information, and fossil records, but they're always changing and evolving, right? So it's never, a phylogenetic tree is never set in stone. That's why science never stops. We're always studying and studying, and people are always studying something that someone studied before them. So that ends sections 1, 2, and 3 for chapter 20. What I would do next is, if you haven't already read the chapter, read the chapter. I would do the dynamic study module when it comes up on Pearson, when we finally get our access code. And then after you've done the dynamic study module, that kind of acts as a tutorial for you. It's not going to be graded, but at the end of the semester, if someone is on the fence, if they have an 88, 89, 78, 79, I'll go back and I'll look and I'll see if you've done the dynamic study modules. And if you have, that shows me that you've made additional effort. You went above and beyond what you were required to do, and that helps me make the decision if I can justify bumping your grade up a letter grade if you're really close on the border. But not only that, they're very, very helpful in helping you understand the material. So I would do the dynamic study module. After you've completed that, do the homework. Those are also meant kind of to be more tutorial, activity driven, to help you understand the material. Finally, I would do the quiz. I would always do the quiz last after you've done everything else, because by then, hopefully you've really got a good grasp on the information.